in this last module, we'll be looking at client interviewing. And of course, we don't have a regular Zoom session this week because you'll be using the time, or whatever time you can find, to do your client interviewing exercise. But I thought it was a good idea to run through a few tips and pitfalls on the interviewing process to get you started. And if you need to look further, there's plenty of resources online. The thing to check though is when you're Googling for interviewing tips or legal interviewing tips, make sure you specify client interviewing. Otherwise you'll get job interview tips, pages and pages of them. Okay, so first of all, what are some of the what's some tips on how to approach it? The first, I think, is always be prepared for interviews. Don't wing it. Have a plan and stick to it. And there's a fairly common plan that goes something like this. First, identify the problem. 2, set up the chronology. 3, develop and check your theories. 4, look for gaps. And 5, sum up. So run through that in a little more detail. 1, identify the problem. Try and get to the root of the problem as quickly as possible. What are you here for? What can I help you with? Clients will, spend a lot of time talking about generalities and hedging around a problem. Sometimes it's quite painful until they get to the problem. So as a professional, particularly if you're using billable hours, it's important to get directly to the problem, or as directly as you possibly can. And then to try and find what part of the problem is a legal problem, because sometimes people come to you with problems that aren't legal problems as such. And then you need to be able to refer them to the appropriate place to deal with those problems. But it can often be hard to tell, and sometimes you need to go dig further before you can actually identify whether there's a legal problem to be solved and what that problem is. The next thing that's a useful tool is the chronology. Start at the beginning and work through stage by stage, because quite often people, and they may have got themselves quite distressed by this point of the interview, will say and then he said, she said, and then she did, and this did, and this did, and oh, and of course that was because back then this happened. So if you try and actually set out a chronology and you're taking notes as the chronology is being laid out, you'll be able to put the missing bits in, you'll be able to fill it in as you go. So the clients probably won't be able to tell you things exactly in order. They will skip forward and back. They will remember things later. But if you're starting to lay that chronology down, then at least you'll know where that fits, and as close as possible to specific dates. I mean, don't press the client if they say it's sometime mid-May, but you may need, of course, to be able to find ways of checking specific dates. So when you move on from the chronology, you then move on to developing and checking theories, which is where you start to figure out what's happened and what the facts are and what the legal interpretation is of that. It's important you don't get committed to a particular theory straight away, because sometimes you'll think something's happening and something else is actually happening, and the interview will take a sudden turn in a different direction. But it's important then, as you start to develop the theories, you reframe and you push them back to the client. You say, okay, so what I'm hearing is this is your problem and this is what you want me to do about it. And they may say yes, or they may say no, you've got it all wrong. And I'll talk about some of the pitfalls of that process in a little bit. So you develop those theories, you check them, you develop new theories. Then you identify gaps. There might be a gap in the chronology, there might be gaps in knowledge, there might be gaps in documentation. But this is where you start thinking, well, what I need to know is this. This is what I need to find out. Now, where are the pieces that are missing? And then you can go back through the checking theories stage again. And finally, it's important to sum up and not just to say to the client, okay, well, you've told me everything, thanks, I'll get back to you and we know how to proceed. It's important that you put what you say, what you believe the situation is to the client, in as much detail as you can without going through all the chronology again, and give them an opportunity to correct, because our own assumptions can make can be our enemy there. So that's a rough outline. That's one way to think about going about it. Let's look at some of the pitfalls of interviewing in no particular order at all. The first is the Rashomon pitfall. Even if you've never seen the Kurosawa film Rashomon, you've probably heard about it. It's feudal Japan, a film set in feudal Japan, and involves a trial. And every person at the trial has a different perspective on what actually happened, and they firmly believe that a different thing happened. And they even conjure up the ghost of the victim, and the ghost has a different opinion of what happened. And it's really become the filmic touchstone for unreliable narrators, and the fact that everyone will perceive things differently, and sometimes it's not a case of being mistaken, it's just the interpretation people put on facts. So it's something to bear in mind when a client says this is exactly what happened, is to think about, well, are there other interpretations of what went on? Is there something about the position that this person is seeing the situation from, or their previous experience, or something about their character that is making them perceive something in a particular way? So the law is full of things like threats or things that have a reasonable person test, or things that involve the interpretation of someone who hears something. And sometimes difference in perception will make all the difference. And it's important that you try and dig into that, and you try to see, is there what is the evidence that is available? And is there a possibility that the client may be interpreting it in a way very differently that others might later on. Other things to think about: be conscious of your own bias, and I don't mean that in a bad way, because we all have our own biases. And one of the obvious ones is when you dislike a client. You're not going to like everyone in the professional world, and you're going to really dislike some clients. Their attitudes can be grating. They might smell bad. They might just be someone who reminds you of someone else you don't like, and they might be overtly offensive. They may express offensive opinions, whatever. And it's important that as a professional, you can be conscious of your own reactions to that. And it doesn't mean you don't react to it, or you don't react personally to it. You try not to show it. I mean, there are plenty of times where you do the "what's my face doing?" They've said something, I want to quickly check that I don't have this horrified look on my face from what they said. But you need to be conscious of your own reactions, because sometimes if you dislike a client, I suppose equally if you like a client, you can be inclined to perceive things in a certain way. And related to that is the idea of your own particular agendas. We all have our own political agendas. We all have things we believe in, we think are important. And it can be all too easy to project those onto a client's story in the way we ask questions, the way we reframe, the things that we choose as relevant. Particularly if there's incidences where we are, and I am very, very conscious of issues of family violence. Seen way too much of it in clients. It's a terrible, terrible social issue. But I'm also conscious of the fact that I can be hyper alert to that, and I can be in situations where the words I choose and the things I ask and the way I ask a client to describe something may be steering them towards an interpretation of the facts that might not be what they would say themselves. And I have to be very conscious of that. Again, it's not a case of not having these particular beliefs or inclinations, but it's a case of being conscious of the fact that you do that. I mean, a very severe example of that, I guess, would be the false memory, the implantation of false memories. And obviously that's more to do with psychological clients than legal clients. But I think lawyers also have the ability to push clients harder than they should, and to have people start believing a different interpretation, particularly if you're an authority figure and you're someone who they're looking to for cues. They're nervous, they're anxious, they don't want to talk about the situation. The labels you put on things can start reframing the way they think about things and the way they remember them. So that's something very important to think about. And again, I don't want to say that we shouldn't be alert to issues like family violence and we should ignore family violence, any of those things. Those things are very important. But we do have to be careful of situations where our own prejudices or assumptions leap in a certain way, and we need to make sure we verify that and we behave in a very objective way. And that's the same from those severe sort of situations, or just things where there are stereotypes. There's a sort of person who reminds us of, maybe your father behaves in a certain way and is a certain sort of person, and you see an older client, an older man, and he pushes all the buttons that your father pushes, and you want to believe something in a certain way, good or bad. You might like your father, and you might think, this is someone who I want to help, and I really, think that this is an interpretation of what's going on. Or more likely, what's more likely to get you in trouble is that they remind you of something that you have a problematic relationship with, and that pushes your buttons as well. And I guess that's a few things to think about. The one thing I also want to talk about is confirmation bias, and that's where the first time something is said or perceived in a certain way can be the most powerful. And it can be easier to say yes or no to something than it is to modify that. And that has an importance when we're reframing, because we have the ability, when we reframe, when a client has given us this sort of disjointed sort of story with all sorts of bits and angles to it, and we say, what I'm hearing is that this is what happened, that the client will again, seeing our position of power, say, yes, that's what happened. And be reluctant, and it may even be a subconscious reluctance, to sit back and go, well, no, that wasn't quite right, that's mostly right, but this part of it was wrong. So again, as an ethical interviewer, you need to be aware of that. And particularly when you're a new interviewer or a younger interviewer, earlier in your career, you're going to be fairly, nervous is not quite the right word, but you're going to be kind of energized and sort of in a performance state when you go into an interview. And if you're not, you're probably way too relaxed, and you're probably not taking it seriously enough. So going into an interview, you have all these kind of, this energy, and you need to sort of be able to step away from yourself and see how that energy can be perceived by others, and also to be able to see that they perceive you as an authority figure. They perceive you as someone who is persuasive. You might not be feeling that yourself. You might be feeling kind of anxious and nervous and thinking, God, I've got to get this right. I've got to be able to do this the right way. But they're going to see you in that way. Anyway, so that's a set of ideas and things to think about. As I said, there's plenty of stuff online. Just make sure you search for lawyer-client interview, not interview, because you just get lots of job interview stuff. But there's plenty of things to follow up on, and I hope that gives you a bit of a head start on some of the things to think about when you're being ethical in client interviewing.